handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman, Seat, over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder, Seat, out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress, Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2-1. Grid to mark, Mike Charlie, 4-7 tree 9er, 8-9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds HEVT, gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Denise Simon Experience. Very happy that you can join us, and I hope you will welcome Stephen Mansfield. Now, I'm a little humbled to be in Stephen Mansfield's company here for somebody I think has written, I think I counted about 22, something around 24 books. Let's put it that way. And he's been on the New York Times bestseller list. So, I mean, I'm pretty, I don't know, way down on the rung here of talent and skills. But his most recent book is Choosing Donald Trump. And just below that it says God, Anger, Hope, and why Christian conservatives supported him. So I'm pretty stoked about having a conversation here with Stephen. So thank you, Stephen, for taking some time to be with us on the Denise Simon Experience.
Oh, it's great to be with you. Thank you.
Yeah, you've got another book I want to kind of get my hands on too, and that's The Miracle of the Kurds, because I'm very, very concerned about them. But that's a sidebar. So on the heels of what we lived through with the Obama administration, and we were beginning to see that any kind of religious protections were, I don't want to say being taken away, although I do think in some cases, certainly with, I think there was a lawsuit with the Little Sisters of the Poor and the nuns. I mean, that one kind of blew my mind. But we saw constant assault on First Amendment protections, certainly with the press, and then, free speech into itself. But we also saw it in components because of Obamacare, that, things like Little Sisters of the Poor or the Hobby Lobby lawsuit were beginning to send some messages to us that I think Christians and conservative Christians were terrified of. Then we come into the election, and we have a choice here. We've got Donald Trump or we've got Hillary. Yikes. Hillary, I don't think ever spoke about any kind of religious protection or anything that was in her core. I think there's some kind of Methodist something or other in her history, but we weren't finding any kind of sanctuary in any of her platform. Then we have Donald Trump, and I'm not too sure we were finding some there either. However, and you can filibuster me, and I'm going to let you do that. I think that we found, the conservative Christians found that at least with Trump, he was moldable to give us some protections there. And I have a feeling that was the spirit of your book. True or false?
Well, I certainly deal with that issue, and I think it's an important one. But you're absolutely right to say that at the time of the 2016 election, most religious conservatives in America felt traumatized by the Obama years and terrified of the prospect of a Hillary Clinton presidency. I mean, you've cited some of them very, very well. The fact is, the average religious conservative just felt like his or her government, was coming for them, from the Green family who owned Hobby Lobby, being sued by the government because they didn't want to offer abortifacients and their employee insurance, to, as you say, the lawsuits against a small order of nuns and what have you. All of that caused a great deal of concern, a great deal of fear. And then people looked at the Hillary Clinton presidency and thought there'd be more of the same. And then you're absolutely right also that Donald Trump, who was not a man who was strongly faith-based or did
No.
not give much evidence of a very pronounced faith throughout his life, although he was churched broadly, he definitely, I think, largely at the hands of Paula White, a prominent television preacher who sort of mentored him in these things, he began to get an education relatively close in to the 2016 presidential election.
And fast.
Yes, very fast. And largely this was because he asked Paula White to host gatherings, listening sessions really, with prominent clergy around the country. So he began to learn about their concerns. He began to learn their language. He began to learn about things like the Johnson Amendment and religious liberty, what it was like to be a black pastor in the inner city, and things of that nature, and began to speak about those things publicly. So some of it came out sounding a little silly, like we're going to start saying Merry Christmas again, and the Johnson Amendment. He was more concerned about the Johnson Amendment than the average evangelical pastor was. But all of this, nevertheless, sounded a tone that the religious community heard. Hey, I'm concerned about your concerns. I'll champion religious liberty. I'll fight for the good fight for faith. And this was all, good news to religious conservatives. And I think that's why many of them found themselves able to overlook his immoral past, found themselves able to overlook his near racist statements at times, his crassness, his encouragement of violence, and find their way to vote for him. And that's one of the great odd stories coming out of the 2016 presidential election.
But then when he chose Mike Pence, I think that was the cherry on the banana split for the Christian conservatives, correct?
Yeah, I think, frankly, while most Christian conservatives are not advocates of murder, if they had a choice right now, they'd much rather have Pence as president. I think it's important. It's an important point that Donald Trump really does feel at home with the religious conservatives. He really is doing more than just pandering. I mean, he may be doing it clumsily, and it may not be a lifetime commitment. But he's sort of put himself on the line here. The appointment to the Supreme Court, his taking on the Johnson Amendment, his championing of religious liberty, whatever the negatives are, and we can talk about those by the hour. If you're a religious conservative watching Donald Trump, he has definitely come down on your side on a great many issues, far more than in the previous 8 years.
Yes.
And so that I think is what has, as they say in Texas, decided a lot of religious conservatives.
Well, and I'm glad you said it that way, because there's a lot of things about Donald Trump to dislike, and some of them clearly outshine the others. However, because of, I think, the depth of the fear coming out of the Obama administration, and the fact that we know that we have got a sector of the population where they may not be religious, they may not go to church every Sunday or more than maybe twice a year, Easter and Christmas, they still have at their core a Christian gene that I think they would necessarily admit they don't necessarily nurture it, but they don't want that DNA challenged. And we knew that it was being challenged and that it would continue to be challenged with Hillary. But I think that there was some unspoken calm that wouldn't happen with Trump. Correct?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And you have to realize, again, I don't want to go back to the theme of how terrified people were, but most politicians get very wishy-washy when they talk about religion. I mean, they just do. It's not their native language. They're not theologians. They're not people who, many of them have only newly begun to talk about faith in a public square. Donald Trump, though, can convince you that he's been lifetime committed to things he's only known about for a few months. So when he started talking about religion during the 2016 election, I mean, he was outspoken. I mean, it's almost, I have to tell you, I'm a Christian. I'm not living in a world where there's a dearth of Merry Christmas greetings going on. But he would talk about, we're going to start saying Merry Christmas again, like it was the primary issue in American history, and people would buy into that. And so you're right. There was a certainty, there was a confidence, there was an unswerving commitment. It felt like, and people, that was a real tonic to people's souls, so to speak, after the Obama years, where even what Christian commitment was there, and I'm not questioning his core Christian commitment. I'm a guy who wrote the book, The Faith of Barack Obama. But when he talked about religion, he was wishy-washy. It felt hesitant, and so people were just the religious conservatives in particular were just very welcoming of Donald Trump's stridency on the issue. And when you combine that with the sort of economic message he had, it really was a trumpet call to that crowd you're talking about. Ed Stetzer, one of the better church analysts in our country, calls it non-practicing evangelicals, people who have that germ of religion, that germ of evangelicalism, even if they're not actively practicing. But Trump's trumpet call, to coin a phrase, made very much reach them, and they turned out in larger numbers than they had in any previous election.
What is remarkable, and I'm kind of surprised that this White House doesn't say it more often, the Trump White House, is that they do have these prayer sessions there, correct?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And why, I would think in order to keep some confidence, I think that they ought to necessarily talk about that a little bit more, although we are hearing, certainly more snippets in his speeches and whatnot in religious protection than we ever would have heard from anybody else. So, but they do have White House prayer sessions, and I think that's significant.
Yeah, it is very significant, and you have to realize this president, though, is very, very sensitive to the press, very sensitive to any kind of attack from the press. And the reality is that when you talk about whatever's going on religiously at the White House, those who are in favor of it quietly are gratified, and those who are opposed are very vocal. That's the way it's always been. It was that way during the Bush administration. And so there's really nothing to be gained by going public. I understand what you're saying. People like you and I would be gratified to hear more about that kind of thing. But the Trump administration, the Trump officials are very sensitive to criticism. And so there's really not much to be gained. They're not going to persuade those who are opposed, and those who are gratified are already quietly gratified by what they do know, and so that's where it stops. And so that's kind of been a policy of the more faith-based administrations in recent decades. They just don't talk about it very much.
Well, we've heard some snippets for anybody that's paying attention. So I mean, at least it's out there. And
Sure.
When it comes to Pence, he's not bashful at all about it, and I'm very happy to see that, which I think that Pence kind of keeps Trump a little centered with this, and that he's carrying that baton a farther distance, I think, than Trump could, but it's also helping Trump. Did I get that part right?
Yeah, I think you're right. Trump is a guy who's a little hard to maintain, but he does respect religious leaders. He does respect religious voices. And I think that Pence is more the spiritual center of this administration. So he works closely with those religious voices that Trump respects. So even though Trump's president and Pence is vice president, I think that Pence is it might be best to say chaplain in chief, so to speak. He's the one sort of setting the spiritual tone within the administration, to Trump's benefit, I have to say. I think he and the other religious voices have kept him from the lesser demons of his personality and helped him lean to the better angels of his personality, and that's been good for us overall.
Trump intermittently, I think, attended church services. We didn't hear a lot of that on the campaign trail, but I think in some of those Sundays, if you will, there were some significant people that I think made an impression on his life. Can you describe some of those?
Sure. The main person that has influenced Trump throughout his life is Norman Vincent Peale. He was the pastor of Marble Collegiate Church in Manhattan, where the family attended. He became the family chaplain pretty much. He did the weddings, did the funerals, and even did building dedications. And Trump says that Norman Vincent Peale, very, very famous preacher, once said that Trump was his greatest disciple. I think what's interesting about Norman Vincent Peale is he not only was the pastor of Marble Collegiate Church, but he was also this outspoken sort of motivational speaker. He's the one who wrote The Power of Positive Thinking.
Right.
He believed very much that attitudes are more important than facts. He believed your words can change your reality. I mean, a lot of what he taught in that side of his work and speaking was very much like The Secret, very much like something you might hear on Oprah Winfrey. But I think that this is what's interesting, is that Norman Vincent Peale definitely said, "I believe in the born-again version of Christianity," and I think he taught that at his church. But the mainstream, the broader stream of his life was more this motivational speaking, power of positive thinking. And I think that Donald Trump drank more from that stream than he did the other. I think he absorbed more the message of you can win, you can shape your reality, your words, align your words to your vision, power of positive thinking. Attitudes are more important than facts kind of perspective. And having read a great deal of Norman Vincent Peale in the work for this book, I hear those phrases coming out of Donald Trump's mouth almost every day. So I think he was very much shaped by that. And then now I think he's very much shaped by that Paula White kind of, some people call it prosperity preacher kind of perspective, but I think it's more mainstream evangelicalism, more a television preacher kind of voice. She's very much the chaplain to his family, very much the spiritual guide, I think, in this administration. And she, again, created those listening sessions that have shaped him profoundly. So really those two voices, Paula White and Norman Vincent Peale, have produced the Donald Trump we know today religiously.
So I can't prove this, and you've done the work. It's almost as though Trump kind of cherry-picked the things out of, those encounters, those religious encounters in his life, and knitted them together that gave him some higher octane, that in some cases gave him some of his bravado and some of his risk-taking. And so I think he used it all to his benefit, not only for, his company and his family and his core there, but going into the presidency. So there was another sense of confidence, correct?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we can all cherry pick what we get in church or what we get from our religious leaders. And I think that Trump basically looked to Norman Vincent Peale to get the footnotes for his fundamental philosophy of life, which is winning. Win at all costs, win in business, win and wreak vengeance on those who harm you. I mean, this is very much Trump's way of operating, and one of the more humorous moments in his life was when he went to Liberty University to speak to what is arguably the largest evangelical undergraduate school in the world. And when he was talking about principles of success, he talked about getting vengeance on those who wrong you in business. And here he is talking to a university built on the message of a guy who has said exactly the opposite. So I think that's sometimes funny. I'm not even sure he's really aware of some of the things that he's saying and how contradictory they are. But all that to say, I think that these it's possible for all of us to go to church or to go hear a speaker and walk away with the things that validate what we already believed. And Donald Trump got a philosophy from his father that was very much about winning. In fact, the two pet names that Donald Trump's father used for Donald were Killer and King. And I think that Donald Trump went to church. He heard what he wanted to hear. I'm not saying he didn't hear other good things, but he heard what he wanted to hear. And so when he thinks of Norman Vincent Peale, he thinks of him as the man who gave him the religious footnotes for his winning philosophy, which, since it's helped to land him in the presidency, he sees as total validation.
Stephen, the kind of the subtitle is God, Anger, Hope, and why Christian conservatives supported him. So you've got God, anger, and hope. Why did you include those three there?
Well, because I think they were all at play. I think that people who voted for Donald Trump, and even those who didn't, were hoping for a better country, were hoping for a better presidency, were hoping for change in America. But as I've documented in an entire chapter in the book, anger was without question a factor. People were definitely looking for someone who could channel their anger, somebody who was as angry as they were and about the same issues. And so this was a factor, no question about it. I mean, a great many people responded to Trump for two main reasons. He was angry about what they were angry about, and he had some degree of business competence and might be able to make something happen. And that's why they chose him over a whole slate of primary competitors, all of whom had deeper spiritual resumes than he did. So clearly religion wasn't the only factor here. But anger was a huge factor, and I think it was a big factor on both sides. And then, of course, the God issue. People are still grappling. I think even the religious right, religious conservatives are still grappling with, we want a nation devoted to God. We want our leaders devoted to God. We're not 100% sure exactly what that means. What does that mean? We want godly leaders, and yet we voted for Donald Trump because he thought he was the best option for God, is what many of them say. So I think we're still grappling with exactly what that means. Do we want people of personal character and spirituality, or do we want people who just will execute the policies that we want, whether they're pagans or not? Martin Luther said he'd rather be ruled by a wise Turk than a foolish Christian. And I think that some people came to that very conclusion in this recent election. And one of my friends walks around calling Donald Trump wise Turk because he sees Trump in that quote, and there's some virtue to that.
There's certainly some truth to that. So sure. Because we have the God component and the anger component, that I think had higher hope for Trump than we did Hillary. Is that why you included hope there?
Yes. I think that people in the entire election were led by their hopes, and that was what I heard a great deal. I interviewed a lot of the religious leaders who voted for Trump and helped to rebrand him, and they would even say, "Look, I didn't expect him to be a saint. I do hope that he becomes a better man. I do hope that he becomes the Christian of my dreams. I do hope that he's not just bought into a religiously oriented worldview, but that he really is personally coming to a personal faith." So hope is maybe more than a lot of other elections. People were hoping that these candidates, and Donald Trump in particular, would become better people, so to speak. And then I have to say also that, I'm not trying to dance on her grave, so to speak, but Hillary Clinton really scared these people.
Oh, yeah.
And so there was an element of I hope he rescues us. I mean, she is one of the most religiously outspoken politicians of our generation. People are surprised when I say that, but there's just no question about it. And yet she could also say things like, in order for abortion rights to take root in our society, long-held religious values are going to have to change. Well, that's about one of the most unwise statements I've ever heard made by a politician. Basically, Stephen, Mansfield, your religious views are going to have to change, so my view of abortion rights can prevail. So people were hoping, somebody rescue us, somebody keep us from the Hillary factor. I mean, this was sort of the way it was. And so all of those words came into play, I think, in the election.
Well, I mean, as we said at the top of this, that the First Amendment protections were certainly under assault, piece by piece by piece by piece. And I think we saw with Hillary was really okay for her, because she never said anything about protecting any of them. And Trump, I think, since he's been in the White House, we've seen a little bit of reshaping of this man.
I think you're right.
I think he's becoming a little bit more centered and a little bit more acceptable, maybe might be the word. Because, I mean, on the campaign trail, he said some outrageous stuff. I mean, and it was outrageous to the point where he wanted to shoot the TV.
Sure, absolutely.
But now we're not quite there anymore. I think we're seeing he's realizing some realities, and I believe that the God and the anger and the hope in what you just described is a big part of that reshaping of him. So I think
you're right. There's no question. I mean, we're sitting here at 1 year into his presidency, or 1 year since he was elected, and I think that the whole question is this man changeable? Is he transformable? And I think that basically a year later, the election, the issue is still the same. There were those who said, and they were right, Hillary Clinton is smart, but from our perspective, she leans evil. Donald Trump is ignorant, but he at least is going to lean to the counsel of people that we trust. In other words, as we've said in this interview, the religious conservatives trust Pence. They trust some of these religious voices around him. They might even trust members of his family more than they trust him, but they don't trust anyone around Hillary Clinton. And that's nobody, I think, went to the polls and said, Donald Trump is an awesome, godly man, and I'm going to vote him into office. They went and they said, he's newly acquired understanding of our issues. He's promising to serve those issues, and I'm going to take the risk of voting for him and trust those leaders around him to keep him accountable. And that was the hope, I think, that defined the election.
I think you nailed it. I think you just nailed it with what work you put into this book, Choosing Donald Trump. I think that your book is important for readers of all types, even the agnostics out there. So they necessarily understand this. You've done a real public service in this book. So, Stephen Mansfield, I want to wish you great luck, and I'm just very humbled that you could spend some time with us on this book and describing it on Donald Trump. So thank you for all of this.
Well, you're very, very kind. It's been great to be with you. I look forward to next time.
All right, good deal. Ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way, so make sure you stay with us.
This is Don Newen, co-host of the Drive Time Sit Rep. Join me as I call into my Intel analyst, Denise Simon, for my daily situation report, or Sit Rep, the Drive Time Sit Rep. Check talkamericaradio.us for more information and show times.
Let me talk to you, black people. When you vote for blacks and put them in office under the banner of the Democrat Party, please explain to me what black people get as a result. This was not a nap that we have been taking. We are in a coma. You know what the interesting thing about pensions is? That's today's money given to people who ain't doing nothing for you today. Get off that black Democrat tit that they've been sucking on. Your country is being stolen from you, and the promise is being stolen from your children, and they're telling you it's all right while the rest of the world is trying to lap us. Well, why are we doing so poorly? 2 words: teachers' unions. Are you kidding me?
Black Man Thinking, Monday nights, 9 p.m.
Hi, I'm Ward Cleaver.
And I'm June Cleaver.
From Leave It to Beaver, and you're listening to Talk America Radio.
Ward, aren't you a little tough on the beaver?
No, we can't say that. Do it again.
She said it on the show. She said it on the show. That's where it came from. It was 30 years ago.
All right, let's try it again. Hi, I'm Ward Cleaver.
And I'm June Cleaver.
Try it again. Don't laugh. Okay, game face.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Ward Cleaver.
And I'm June Cleaver.
From the hit show Leave It to Beaver. And you're listening to Talk America Radio.
Ward, don't you think you're being a little hard on the beaver?
You're listening to your local news source, WLBB, News Talk 1330 and FM 106.3.
ATA Digital Dallas. Talk America Radio. Simulcasting on WDDQ, Talk 92.1, Adel, Valdosta, Georgia. And WJHC, Talk 107.5, Jasper, Florida.
Hey there, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. Certainly going to change gears in a big, huge way because I've been lucky enough to kind of get a distant buddy of mine to join us, and he is part of a website that I follow very, very closely, and that's the Counter Extremism Project. So Stephen Cohen has been dedicated to this kind of mission for a long time, and he's been very gracious to join us on the Denise Simon Experience because we seem to keep having these extremists out there. I call them, the worst part of them are the militant ones, but their site and their people that work at the Counter Extremism Project do remarkable work. So thank you, Stephen, for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for that, gracious introduction, and I hope I can live up to it.
No doubt, no doubt. Now, Stephen, this organization is actually it's got a CEO of a former ambassador, Mark Wallace, who I think has been on my show before, and we talked about Iran. And
yes, I believe that's so.
And then you've got Fran Townsend, and I've come to I've come to be a very big fan of her resume as well. And Counter Extremism Project just recently launched a fascinating database. And this database includes things like the militants, their networks, their financial support, material support, communications, and all those kinds of things. Stephen, that's got to be a Herculean task to kind of keep up with that, isn't it?
Well, that was one of our goals when we launched the organization in 2014. Was we wanted to do a few things, but do them very well. And as you mentioned, Ambassador Wallace was one of the founders. Fran Townsend was one of the founders. Former Senator Joe Lieberman was one of the founders, and other distinguished former
ambassadors,
bipartisan leaders. So we wanted to be not like the traditional think tank you see in Washington, and there are many, but we wanted to be more of an advocacy organization as well. So we do both policy and advocacy. So the idea was that we wanted to educate people about the growing threat from extremist ideologies, but we also wanted to pressure the financial and material support networks that allow these groups to continue to propagandize and recruit and radicalize people. And we wanted to also advocate for smart laws and policies that might have an impact on the ability of these groups to do these very same things and to carry out the kinds of attacks that unfortunately we've seen happen with too much regularity.
Mm-hmm. Now, in establishing the Counter Extremism Project, Stephen, was there a need for this because there were gaps in what Joint Terrorism Task Force does, and FBI does, and CIA does, and the New York Police Department and other intelligence agencies? Were there some gaps there, or were you just seeing that there had to be some kind of cohesion in this, and that is what your brand is?
Well, we wanted to, not that there are gaps, but we felt that there was a role to be played by the private sector. We're not affiliated with the government, although we work with the government in many ways. But we thought that there was a role to play by the private sector, and so that was one of the reasons we built this database, because it was part of the idea of informing people and becoming a resource for people to understand the nature of these groups, not the groups themselves, their leaders, the kind of people who are raising money for them, the kind of people who are just propagandists, and what's going on in country to country. The attack in New York City is foremost on our minds right now. That was a terrible tragedy. Monday is the 2-year anniversary of the attack in Paris. Mm-hmm. That where many people lost their lives and almost 350 people were injured. And so we've had these series of attacks, but we want to be able to keep it in context and to make sure that people can understand the nature of these groups, what motivates them, and what they can do kind of push back against these groups. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about the online aspect of our work, but that's a very big part of that, is helping people to recognize how the radicalization process can work and what is available to people online that shouldn't be, that facilitates these kinds of tragic events like we saw in New York City on Halloween.
Stephen, operations like Boko Haram or Al Qaeda in the sub-Sahara, or the Taliban, or any of these kinds of groups, some of them have a social media presence, a digital footprint, if you will, but some of them don't necessarily that we can see. And a lot of your work, I think, is dedicated to finding those connectivities, that connective tissue that isn't out there for necessarily the public. So that's got to be a very difficult thing, correct?
Well, we do monitor quite extensively, and you're absolutely right. It is a very complicated process because not all of these groups are as sophisticated as ISIS. Thank goodness, but that's clearly one of the reasons that ISIS was so successful and remains successful online, insofar as their ability to spread their propaganda and incite people to take action on their behalf. Some of these other groups may not be as sophisticated, especially to an English-speaking audience, but nevertheless, they are all becoming much more sophisticated in using the tools of online communications, and that's one of the reasons that we've been so determined to change the attitude of internet and social media companies and pressure them to acknowledge some of the very dangerous things that are taking place on their platforms and take action to eliminate some of the things that they themselves say that they're dedicated to removing from their platforms. So we spend a lot of our time researching what is going on on the online space, but we also spend a lot of time taking what we find and using it as a means to show the social media companies that they're not doing enough to eliminate some of the most egregious materials that are used to radicalize people online and get them to commit horrific acts against innocent people, whether it's here in the United States or in Europe.
Counter-Extremism Project is actually a global operation now. I think you've got a representation in London and in Brussels. Is that right?
Yes, we have an office in Brussels and an office in Berlin, and we have wouldn't necessarily call it a formal office in London, but we do have representatives in London. And in various other places around the world, and that's necessary just to be able to keep track of how this phenomenon continues to change. It's a constantly changing environment. You do something that can maybe restrict the ability of some of these groups to operate, and they will try to adapt. And so it's a constantly you have to constantly update your skills and the kinds of tools you use, because these groups continue to evolve, learn, change their tactics as one thing may be less attractive to them, or one thing may be less available. They'll move to some other kind of a platform, or they might change the kind of language they use or images they use to try to prevent the things that they're posting to be taken down or to be identified immediately and taken down. So you're always having to kind of retrain yourself, learn new things, and try to keep up with these groups who are awfully inventive, unfortunately.
Resourceful.
Yes, resourceful. And So, it's a constant challenge, and just like it's a constant challenge to keep pressure. And we were very happy to see, frankly, the Congress become involved in recent weeks on this question of Russian meddling, because there was a lot of information that maybe wasn't pertinent to the issue at hand that was revealed in those hearings, just about the way that Facebook and Google and Twitter operate, and the kinds of things that they may have control over in those areas in which they don't have that much control over. I mean, I think one of the bigger takeaways from those hearings was that Facebook really didn't have a grasp of who was taking out ads and the kinds of information that was being posted. And we've seen that same thing from time to time in the extremist space as well, where, when we began this and we started to talk to Twitter and Facebook and Google about the problem of extremist materials online and its potential to radicalize people, they were frankly not ready to even acknowledge that the problem existed. And so there's been a good deal of progress insofar as these companies are willing to acknowledge the problem and pledge to do more to impact it. We just think it's necessary that they do things in a transparent way, and that we can see not only progress but certain things that are maybe detailed for a lot of people, but make a big difference in the overall impact that they're having to do the very things that they say. They say they don't want the internet and social media company platforms to be a welcoming environment to extremists. We want to make sure that they continue down this path and they do the things that are both systematic and permanent, so that things that are uploaded and taken down cannot be uploaded again. And we can talk a little bit more in detail about that if you'd like.
Well, I want to kind of go over to Anwar al-Awlaki here for a second, because it looks like he is the springboard, although he's dead, but his work, his life's work after he left the United States, and even I guess while he was in the United States, is really the springboard for where all of the genesis of all of this militancy kind of manifested itself. Did I say that right?
Yes, I'd say we found evidence of about at least 55 extremists in the United States and in Europe who were directly impacted by the sermons and lectures that they watched that were readily available online. And this was an individual who President Barack Obama in 2011 ordered to be killed because of his operational, it wasn't just because of his lectures, but it was his operational position in Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and the evidence that he had a direct hand in a number of attack attempts, including the underwear bomber. And that, so it wasn't just the lectures, but we found it just unbelievable that, 6 years after his death, these lectures were so easily accessible to very impressionable people en masse. I mean, in August of this year, there were still 70,000. If you did an Anwar al-Awlaki search on YouTube, you'd still get 70,000 hits. Now, they've done some work since then to take down some of Anwar al-Awlaki's videos, but it's taken the Counter-Extremism Project since 2014, appealing to YouTube over and over and over again in many different ways and in forums to actually get them to acknowledge that it is not
cured.
That his lectures should fall under the be prohibited by their terms of service. If you look at their terms of service, and all of these companies, they have very grand and extremely specific terms of service that prohibit, calls to violence, prohibit the, endorsement of terrorism, and then they allow not just Don Morlacki, but other radical clerics to proliferate on the site. We found after the Manchester bomber that not only was there a bomb-making video rarely available on YouTube, it was still there 2 months after the attack, but the radical cleric that this individual was inspired by was still all over the internet as well. So you have these real inconsistencies, we feel, and we're going to keep at it, and we're going to use every means that we have to remind people about the fact that these companies aren't being systematic and are not being consistent in the kinds of things that they're taking down.
Well, if they obviously, the Googles, the YouTubes, the Twitters, and the Facebooks, they obviously have a team that is watching for, because they use these software platforms that are developed, and they watch for things that may be in violation of their terms of service. And so they have these built-in departments, if you will, that watch these things. So it's kind of like they need not to, you need not to have to keep going over there because they already have that built in. But they're obviously either slow to respond or they're not using the right keyword searches or keeping pace with a glossary of terms.
Well, it's a very it's a complicated situation. A couple of years ago, the only time they would consider taking something down is when one of their users called them and said, "This is inappropriate, you should take it down," and then it would go into a queue and somebody would look at it and then they would make a decision. And but now, after all this time, we said, look, you should be more systematic, and you should apply the standards, and you should make sure that everybody knows about it, what those standards are, and how you're carrying this out. Now they do have more people involved in moderation, but they're still not doing this industry-wide in a systematic way, so that you could have maybe something that's uploaded, taken down, and then re-uploaded on another platform. One of the things that works quite well is how they find and eliminate images of child pornography on the internet. And the reason they can do this now is because back in 2008 or 2009, a gentleman named Dr. Hani Farid, who was a computer science professor at Dartmouth University, teamed up with Microsoft, and they developed this software called PhotoDNA. And so it basically works like this. There's not an infinite number of known images of child pornography. They started with the worst of the worst. Those images that are clearly illegal, that the age of the child is not in question, and what is taking place is clearly child exploitation. So they took this subset, and then they have Dr. Farid's technology extracts a digital signature from that image. And so when somebody tries to upload that image, all of the major social media companies and internet companies run the software. When somebody tries to upload one of those images, it can find it immediately. They've eliminated like 100 million images of child pornography every year using this technology.
Wow.
Dr. Freed began working with us in 2016, and we developed the next generation of that technology that can also detect videos, because a lot of this material is moved, as you know. A lot of the propaganda material is no longer images, it's videos and audio files. So once you've identified those images, videos, or audio files that are vicious and are prohibited by the terms of service of a company, and you what they call hash it, that means extract a digital signature, you should be theoretically able to find that whenever it is uploaded again.
I see.
On the platform that's running that software. And so in June of 2016, we rolled this out, and we offered it to social media companies for free, as consistent with what they did when they rolled out photo DNA in 2008. Thus far, the companies have not chosen to use this technology. They do say that they are using machine learning or artificial intelligence. They're doing more of that. However, we continue to see gaps in the effectiveness of their moderation policies, but we continue to help them improve, and we'd like to be optimistic, but we think it's really necessary to keep the pressure on, because without the pressure, there's not a lot of incentive for these companies to act responsibly.
Well, the work that the Counter Extremism Project is doing, I mean, you guys are kind of like silent heroes. Really, you're pushing a lot of things that would certainly put in some orange cones into this extremism, this ideology, the propaganda, the manifesting it throughout the world on the internet, if for nothing else. And you're building the tools, you're putting the pressure on, and I mean, it's for the civil society wherever it is across the globe. So, ladies and gentlemen, please make sure that you jump on over to counterextremism.com and sign up for their updates and whatnot, because they're doing just remarkable work. I would say, without a lot of fanfare, which is the reason I had Stephen on, and wanted to give some traction to the work that they're doing over there, and really, it's very positive, and it's certainly in the vein of national security. So, Stephen Cohen, thanks so much for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience, and I want you to know that you're invited back anytime, because we got about 200 topics in this whole thing that we could talk about.
Well, I thank you so much for having me, and if I can put in a plug, it's www.counterextremism.com, and we also produce a daily news summary that's called I Am Extremism, and on our website you can sign up for that if you'd like. So I thank you so much for having me, and thank you for everything you do, and I'd love to come back again and give you good news, maybe one of these days.
All right.
But otherwise, thanks for having me.
All right, thank you. And thanks, ladies and gentlemen. Stay with us, though. We'll be back again just shortly.
You can't handle the truth. The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress. Mike Charlie, 4-3-5-9-2-1. Grid to mark. Mike Charlie, 4-7-3-9-8-9 out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck. 2 rounds HEBT. Gas TOT 5
ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Denise Simon Experience. Very happy that you could be with us. I got the distinct pleasure of having Anastasia Boden with us. Now, she's actually been a previous guest on the show, but it's been a while. She's an attorney over at the Pacific Legal Foundation, and before that, I think you were at Cato Institute. Is that right, Anastasia?
That's right.
Woo! Okay, didn't get that one wrong. Thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking about occupational licensing, and that doesn't sound like it ought to be a big deal, but when you do some reading, that this occupational licensing thing affects, it looks like, Anastasia, about 2/3 of the employment out there and across the country in some form or fashion, doesn't it?
It's about a third. A third of Americans now need government permission before going into the job of their choice. And like you said, it doesn't seem like a big deal because people usually assume that it applies to people like lawyers or doctors, and they think, hey, that's probably necessary. But what they don't realize is that occupational licensing has crept to include now some of the most innocuous occupations out there. I mean, in some states you need a license to mow a lawn, to put a bouquet of flowers together, to apply makeup, which is something that women across the country do for themselves every single morning. So really there is an abuse out there of occupational licensing laws that is keeping people out of honest jobs.
So this is really state government. I guess it's really at the state level that's regulating professions.
That's right. It's usually at the state level. We tend to think that the states are better than the federal government is at regulating things, but the states can be just as abusive. And, the laws vary from state to state. And I think that varying alone goes to show how ridiculous occupational licensing is. I mean, in some states you need something like 1,500 hours to be a cosmetologist. In others you need something like, a day's worth of training. So it just goes to show how arbitrary these laws can be.
So 900 hours to learn how to braid hair, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in some states, you need a cosmetologist license to braid hair. And then when you go and look at the cosmetologist licensing procedure, if you look at the exams and the training, it doesn't even teach hair braiding. So, but of course, the people in these occupations, they have an interest in including more and more ancillary services, occupations that are related to their occupation, but not actually what they're doing. They want to include that in the definition of their occupation so that they can maintain their monopoly over that occupation and make it harder for other people out there to get into that same industry.
Poking around, Anastasia, I've seen that some states are kind of leading the charge. I think Arizona is taking a hard look at it. But then other states are really much more aggressive and assertive on this. So it's there's there's clearly not a balance any place.
Yeah, it's interesting. There has been a movement recently to ease up on occupational licensing because some of these abuses have been so profound. We saw in New York that they were trying to pass a licensing law for watching a friend's dog. Because of things like that, people are waking up to this problem and kind of poking into it and seeing that these laws aren't really on the books to protect the public. They're there because industry insiders have lobbied for them as a means of putting up barriers to new competition. A lot of times these licensing requirements don't have anything to do with protecting the public or making the people better at the skills that they need to enter the occupation. They're just there to create red tape, which keeps competition out. And so as people become more aware of this, there has been a movement in some states to kind of scale back, to maybe get rid of licensing for occupations that don't need them, or maybe to make it harder to enact licensing laws in the first place. In Arizona, there was a bill that made it easier for plaintiffs to challenge occupational licensing laws in court because it's very hard to do. I do it all the time, but it's very difficult to win these cases. So in any event, we are seeing this movement. We tried to support a bill last year in California to do the same thing that would have repealed licensing laws for things like being a locksmith or being a hearing aid fitter, being a tree trimmer, being an upholsterer actually requires a license with training and educational experience in California. But of course, that got nowhere in California. So some states are better than others on this issue. I recently was writing about Maryland. In Maryland, they put a new one this year. They have a new occupational licensing requirement for cosmetologists. It already requires all sorts of training, and now they want continuing education requirements just to renew the licenses that these people already have. So it's crazy out there navigating from state to state, but hopefully the trend is scaling back, not piling on more.
Anastasia, am I right in saying that there's something in my gut that tells me a couple of years ago there was actually a movement to do this same thing with babysitting, which I would argue is one of the oldest, kids jobs out there. And then on top of that, I think they wanted to unionize them or unionize housekeepers or, maids. Is that part and parcel kind of a spinoff to this occupational thing?
Well, I have to tell you, it certainly wouldn't surprise me. Nothing would surprise me. I mean, like I said, dog sitting, mowing a lawn, putting together a bouquet, interior decorating, these are all things that really should not be licensed. Interior decorating, how do you even teach someone that? I mean, it's all a matter of opinion, right? And what's the danger of being unlicensed? You're going to make somebody's house unattractive, and in whose opinion? How do you even judge that? So it certainly wouldn't surprise me to hear about babysitting. But one thing that I thought was funny was that when they did try to pass the dog sitting law in New York, one thing that came out was, of course, they didn't require a license for watching kids, but watching dogs, that requires a bunch of money and training and experience.
There's something that tells me that there was kind of a springboard. This was kind of a springboard to unionizing some of these people under SEIU or something. But okay, so what is generally the fee? Have you found a variety of a fee list here that goes from $10 a month or $5,000 a year to something else ridiculous?
Yeah, it depends on the occupation, but even, to keep coming back to cosmetology because I think it's so fascinating, in some states it can be $500 just the fee to apply. Now, that's a lot of money for cosmetology. That's an occupation that it's not a high income occupation. It's a low to mid income occupation. So $500 just to apply to get your foot in the door, that's a lot of money for a lot of people. If anything, that occupation should be something that is easy for people to start at the bottom of the ladder,
entry
all
level,
the way up to the top. Right. That should be an entry level job that's easy to enter and doesn't keep people out just because they can't afford it. And yet we see $500 for something like that. In California, for getting a contractor's license, you basically have to have a contractor's license to do anything in California. To help
Florida
install.
Too.
Yeah, to install anything. You have to get a permit, first of all, to install anything on your property, and then you have to have a licensed contractor do it. Yeah,
yes.
Exactly. And for that can be pretty expensive, too. I think in some states it's like $1,000 to get licensed, and yet, the minimum threshold requirement is you have to make a minimum of $1,000 a year in order to get the license. So if you were making, if you were just working as a handyman in your spare time and only maybe, as a second job and making a couple grand a year, you would spend half of that just to get the license.
So, the second oldest job is being a newspaper boy, delivering the newspaper. Well, that's kind of going away. So these young kids, want to go do something else, which would be cutting the grass or babysitting. And now you have this little impediment. So even to kind of be your own little entrepreneur at a young age, you probably don't even qualify because you're not at a legal age to enter into a contract to be able to get a license, right?
That's right. It's interesting. We're just keeping more and more people out of the workforce, and the people who are hardest hit tend to be people who need economic opportunity the most. This is the people who want to do something in their spare time, have a second job, or people who are younger and don't have very many skills. Yeah, seamstress. That's exactly right. Somebody who they can do some sewing at night and make some extra cash. And this is something that it's actually part of the sharing economy too. We see the sharing economy opening up a lot of opportunity for people to make some extra cash. They can drive for Uber. They can rent open bedrooms in their homes, or if they're out of town, they could rent their house on VRBO. But whenever there is a new opportunity for people to disrupt the market and make some extra cash and encroach on ways that other people are making money, you immediately see backlash from the existing people in the industry, and they're trying to keep these people out. So if there's not already licensing laws on the books for these things, you'll see then the taxi companies try to get laws outlawing Uber explicitly, or the hotels saying, no, you can't have VRBO without a license, because we want to be the only people who are renting out rooms in this city.
Well, that just shows you that, people are trying to, be creative, think out of the box, rely on themselves, and all of a sudden here come these roadblocks. And so we mentioned licensing fees. They can go from the sublime to the ridiculous. But then when you have to go through training or some kind of, ongoing education program that a state may mandate, or you have to perform some kind of apprenticeship, I would argue that that's even more expensive, causing even it to be more prohibitive.
Yeah, I think that's right. And nowadays it's getting easier. I think the time is right now, where if there's been any time in history, right now is the right time for repeal of some of these laws, because we don't need them anymore, because people are so much better able to govern themselves. They have so much more access to information and immediate feedback on providers of services. We don't need to rely on the government, which frankly isn't often doing a very good job of policing bad actors anyway. But, nowadays we have Yelp, we have Angie's List, we have all of these mechanisms of checking in and seeing if people that we want to hire are doing a good job. And, we have technological resources that make repeal possible, because now you know what you're getting in a way that you didn't in previous generations.
So basic things like washing windows or washing cars, that's another occupational kind of thing that might be thrown in this list?
Sure. In a list that should be deregulated? Yeah, I mean, I can imagine that seems like there's a very little risk to the public from the unlicensed practice of washing windows or washing cars. And even short of licensing, there are things, maybe perhaps there's a role for the government, but it doesn't always have to be occupational licensing, which is the most onerous way of regulating somebody, the most expensive way, the most restrictive way. What about just certification, or what about requiring people to
registration? That's it.
Registration, exactly, or belong to some sort of private industry group, or get certified by some private group. There's plenty of alternatives to outright licensing, which, is, as more studies come out, we're just seeing it's killing jobs, it's driving up the prices, it's limiting choices, it kills innovation. There's little benefit to the public, and yet lots of demonstrable harms.
Well, I guess the next question, has there been a study, Anastasia, on who this necessarily affects the most? Is there kind of a model of a particular part of the population that it affects the most, or industry? Because, I mean, I'm seeing like felons, they get out, they've done their time, they've done everything they're supposed to do. Very few people may necessarily want to hire them because they've got a criminal record, but although they've done everything they were supposed to do. And as a consequence, maybe they want to go have a car washing business, and they're not financially able to go through all these, steps and hoops and bureaucracies in order to launch a business to kind of get them on their feet, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. There are a lot of studies out there about the way that occupational licensing disproportionately affects people who have been convicted of crimes, because they get out of jail, they don't have many resources, they don't have the resources to navigate that very complicated and expensive licensure process. And what does that do? The only good that serves is to force people into repeat crime, because they have no other way of providing for themselves. They have no way of rehabilitating themselves and earning a living for themselves. So that's a very tragic effect it has. Another thing that's come out, another fact that's come out, is that occupational licensing has a disproportionate effect on military spouses, because military families, of course, move very frequently, and when they move from state to state, or even within states, but between cities, because cities might erect their own occupational licensing laws, the military spouses have to get licensed again and again, and that's very expensive. So that's a population that it disproportionately burdens. I think laws in general, because the way that democracy works, they tend to target the people who don't have the political clout to protect themselves through the political process. So, historically, laws have been used to keep politically powerless groups like racial minorities or religious minorities or people with fewer resources, the poor. Laws are always going to have a disproportionate effect on those groups because they're not able to lobby for themselves and to protect themselves.
Well, I can even see senior citizens, they've been diagnosed with something, they've got a prescription that, they can't necessarily afford, so they're going to have to go do something, take in sewing at night, as I said earlier, and they may, make $100 a month in order to pay, and that could be affected to them too, such that they're not even necessarily able to drive, perhaps, that people would drop off their sewing or drop off their child to be watched for a couple hours, then all of a sudden, So, that could affect that whole segment of the population too, correct?
Oh, absolutely. And you mentioned, transportation. Transportation is one of the most heavily regulated industries. It's very anti-competitive. And like you said, senior citizens often rely on taxis or, there are special companies devoted to transporting elderly people or handicapped people. And yet, because of these regulations, there's not very much competition in that industry, which drives up the prices, and that disproportionately affects elderly people who rely on those transportation services. Another way that the elderly are affected is that, they consume medical services. And again, in this day and age, there's a lot of innovative ways of providing medical services. And yet those services don't come to market, or the prices are jacked up because of regulations. So, hearing aid fitting is an occupation that is licensed pretty stringently in a lot of states. And even though, the FDA itself has said that the hearing aids themselves have changed so much in recent years with technological advances that they really should be sold over the counter if you want. If you want to go to a hearing aid fitter, fine. But if you don't want to, there's apps or there's different ways that you can tune it yourself nowadays. And yet when states require licensure for hearing aids such that you can't even buy one off the shelf if you wanted to, it's just driving up the cost for senior citizens.
Is there one state, we mentioned Maryland earlier, are they one of the worst, or New York one of the worst? California, Florida?
Well, California, of course, is one of the worst.
Well, that was kind of dumb.
But Maryland actually, I had read recently that they were going to be part of this working group to take a hard look at their occupational licensing laws and reconsider some of them, and to get past some of these assumptions that occupational licensure is good and really take a hard look. And yet, we see this law passed just this session to impose yet more regulations on cosmetologists. So it's hard to say. Even the states that are headed in the right direction can sometimes be subject to regulatory capture and take a few steps back.
Man, what a sad commentary it is. The little girl in the corner who wants a lemonade stand. We've already seen, horror stories about that, they have to be inspected. They can't, in certain places, they can't do it without some kind of a permit. And then it has to, keep down the sugar regulations, and then the signing, and that they can't work more than, 4 hours,
Yeah, you're right. It is. In some cases, it's just outright absurd. Like you said, you do see the lemonade stand next door that gets shut down because it doesn't have a permit. In a lot of cases, it's silly, when the government says that you need a license to be a florist because the consumers might prick their fingers on the wiring that holds together bouquets. Some of these things are laughable. Other things really are sad. When you see some of my clients who have been just shut out of their jobs for reasons that have nothing to do with their fitness. These people are fully fit to do what they want to do. They just can't afford the licensure, or I bring cases in what are called competitors veto cases, where you can be shut out of an industry just because the competitors don't want you there. So, these things they're sad. They're very sad. But I like to stay optimistic and say I do think that the tide is turning, that as more information comes out about these laws, that states are waking up to occupational licensing abuse. And of course, Pacific Legal Foundation is out there, and we're bringing cases all the time, and we're trying to get these licensing laws struck down under the Constitution and to set the precedent so that in the future the government can't do this again. It can't deny people their basic right to earn a living simply because it wants to favor the existing businesses.
So the pursuit of happiness has got to have a license, it's got to have a fee, it's got to have a permit, it's got to have an application, it's got to have ongoing education.
Yeah, at the moment, that is pretty sad. But like I said, I do think things, the tide is turning. I have to stay hopeful. And, we've had a lot of success lately in our cases.
Good.
Our competitor's veto case I was mentioning, I was representing a moving company who tried to get a license to run a moving company, which, again, you wouldn't think you have to go through all of these hoops to run a moving company. You really should just need a truck and knowledge of the city and a couple of strong people, and that should be good enough. But no, in some states you need to navigate an entire regulatory regime. And so our client had gone in West Virginia to get it, and the existing businesses protested his application, and he was denied the license on the basis that his business wasn't, quote, necessary. The government determined that there were enough moving businesses in West Virginia. So we sued, and, in the course of the lawsuit, we found out that, it was just a mover's monopoly. It was crazy. The state hadn't granted a new license in something like 20 years. Everybody who had applied had been protested and then eventually denied. And following our lawsuit, the West Virginia legislature repealed that law. So, when you have small victories like that, and within the next week our client was out providing moves in West Virginia, when things like that happen, I'm able to stay optimistic for the state of economic liberty in this country.
Well, congratulations on that one. Tell us real fast. We got a couple minutes left. What is the Economic Liberty Project?
The Economic Liberty Project is one of our practice areas at Pacific Legal Foundation. It's the project in which I work, and it's dedicated to vindicating people's right to earn a living free of irrational government regulation. So a lot of our cases are occupational licensing laws because that's just the biggest abuse. That's the biggest thing keeping people down nowadays, keeping people from being able to lift themselves out of poverty or just to earn a simple living for themselves or their families. So we take a lot of occupational licensing cases, but we'll take any case that where the government is regulating and it's preventing people from becoming an entrepreneur somehow. Our goal is to bring these cases very strategically. We are a nonprofit law firm, so we have to choose our cases carefully. We represent all of our clients for free, and we want to get to the Supreme Court and set the precedent that the government can only impede your right to earn a living when it's doing so for some health or safety reason, where it's related to making sure that you're fit for your trade. It can't impede your right to earn a living just to dole out political favors to certain groups, or just for irrational reasons when it hasn't really thought it through. There has to be a good reason when you're going to impede that precious right to earn a living. That is one of our most fundamental constitutional rights, the foundation for the pursuit of happiness. We want to protect that in the courts and represent clients who find their right being threatened.
Remarkable good work. Great explanations here. I guess I'll have to think twice if I want to make some homemade jams here and start selling them. But Anastasia, a remarkable job. And I just love it that you guys, certainly represent the little guy who's, trying to, be his own entrepreneur and be in charge of his own destiny. And you guys are Pacific Legal are doing a remarkable job. So thanks for joining us, and come back again soon.
Hey, thanks for having me. And I tell you what, better yet, why don't you try making some jam, and if the government goes after you, give us a call.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
Have a good day.
All right, bye.
This is Don Newen, co-host of the Drive Time Sit Rep. Join me as I call in to my intel analyst, Denise Simon, for my daily situation report, or SITREP, the Drive Time SITREP. Check talkamericaradio.us for more information and show times.
Hi, this is Denise Simon, the host of the Denise Simon Experience. I feel compelled to tell you people that Don Newen is my favorite talk radio host, period. Not Mark Levin, not Rush Limbaugh. I can't do this.
Do it, Denise. Read it. Read it, Denise.
Not Sean Hannity or Laura Ingraham, but yep, Don Newen. Cowen Logic Radio is featuring the ever-stellar, highly gifted Don Newen, right here on Talk America Radio.
This is Don Newen with Cowboy Logic Radio. On behalf of my beautiful co-host, Donna Fiducia, I'd like to express my gratitude to Denise Simon for those kind words. I don't think I could have done it better if I would have written that myself. Cowboy Logic Radio, every Tuesday night, 9 p.m. Eastern, right here on Talk America Radio.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is AJ Gaynor, host of Blowin' Smoke. Who is AJ Gaynor? Well, he's formerly the drummer for national recording artist 12 Stones, who you've probably never heard of, but why does he have a show? Well, he's widely read, widely traveled, and he enjoys the search for new perspectives. Why should you listen? First, because this is not your father's talk show. Second, because the idea here is, each week I sit down with you for about an hour, and we discuss some current events, usually the political ones, but not always, and we try and identify what's real, and of course, what's the propaganda. We know the mainstream media has a narrative they're pushing, and on Blowin' Smoke, we challenge that narrative, sometimes with simple facts, other times with instinctive logic, but always with truthful, honest debate. I've always said that my show is about finding perspective. I believe the perspective I provide my listeners is indeed unique. Tune in to Blowin' Smoke with yours truly, AJ Gaynor, right here on the Talk America Radio Network and at talkamericaradio.us.
You're listening to your local news source, WLBB, News Talk 1330 and FM 106.3.
ATA Digital Dallas. Talk America Radio. Simulcasting on WDDQ, Talk 92.1, Adel, Valdosta, Georgia, and WJHC, Talk 107.5, Jasper, Florida.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for hanging with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. I got the distinct pleasure of having Jarrett Stepman with us over at the Daily Signal, otherwise known as the caller ID says Heritage Foundation. That's what I really like. And I think, Jarrett, you've been on my show one other time. I forget the topic, but one thing. Thanks for being here.
You're quite welcome.
That came and went without a lot of it had more fanfare for I don't know, the initial release, and then it just kind of faded away, and that's the JFK files. And we've been waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, and then all of a sudden we didn't get what we wanted to, and then there was kind of an uproar, and there was more news about the uproar, not all the files. I was like, okay, you'll get them in 6 months. Well, no, wait a minute, you'll get them next week. And then we got some more, but there's still more.
It is incredible, given that the agencies had really decades to prepare for this moment when these files were to be released, and that there are these now more delays for another, which they want 6 months to continue redacting documents and reviewing things to be released. It is kind of incredible that this is kind of allowed to be strung out like this. And one of the reasons why I think people have stopped paying attention is we all kind of expected there to be this big document dump and maybe some new findings about this. Of course, this case where the president was assassinated, I mean, one of the biggest stories of, you could say, of the 20th century. There's a lot of interest in it, and of course, the American people want to know, what happened. They want the details from what our agencies were talking about. Unfortunately, a lot of that information is still hasn't been released, even though we do know a lot about what took place on that day when Kennedy was assassinated. There seems to be a lot that's still out there that we don't know.
You know what's pretty fascinating, Jarrett, about this whole thing, and it's this. We've had, 35, 40 years of waiting. We got a little bit in the Warren Commission. Of course, when that came out, nobody really completely believed it. And then we've had all these documentaries and movies and all these trials where people have tried to recreate the whole scene from the Texas School Book Depository, and people can't believe this, can't believe that. And then we were in, Russia, and then we got Cuba, and then we got Mexico, and then we got New Orleans, and then we got this, and we got that. And so nothing has been settled. And still today, nothing is settled, is it?
No, and that's quite true. I would say a lot of those details have still been. I think they're still up to debate and question. I mean, but the funny thing to me is the most basic facts that we do know are the things that have been questioned. I think one of the big ones, in which I wrote about at the Daily Signal, is this idea that it was somehow a right-wing hate that killed President Kennedy, that it was somehow conservatives and anger fueled by the people of Dallas that ended up killing the president. And, with Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who, presumably pulled the trigger of the gun, to pin him on conservatives, which has been happening for a very long time, to pin his actions on conservatism or right-wingers is so wildly off the mark, based on public records, on knowledge that's very easily obtained. The fact that this guy was a very hard-left communist seems to have been lost in this narrative that somehow it was reactionaries in the United States that are attributable to the president's death.
Well, he was a hard right-wing guy because he wasn't sympathetic with Russia. It was because he was a Marine. And I think,
right.
And that's the reason why I think the New York Times has really been the culprit that seems to keep adding gasoline to this fire. They really have a lot of disdain for conservatives. They have a lot of disdain essentially for the military. And I would say they have an awful lot of disdain for the South, especially when it comes to Texas. And I would argue that there's probably some communist sympathizers that we once know that were on the payroll of the New York Times, and it may still have some over there today. So we keep getting these little seeds that kind of come out, and they kind of grow and nurture, and they kind of show up in these paragraphs on page 6, right?
Absolutely. The communist, at least those who make excuses for communism, like this section that they've been running, which is quite unbelievable, which is called the Red Century, which is a tribute to Bolshevism at 100 years, which you would think, okay, we're going to have some pieces about how the evils of communism are, but there are a lot of pieces have been run that have essentially been puff pieces on Lenin as an environmentalist, things that try to paint a slightly rosier picture of communism. So they've definitely made a lot of excuses there at the New York Times for what is the most dangerous ideology of the 20th century, or any century. But it is sad that from day one, I mean, just the day after Kennedy was shot, the New York Times had an editorial that basically said that Kennedy's death was to be pinned on this right-wing hate in Dallas. And unfortunately, this narrative has continued to this day. As we see with any manner of shootings or things in the United States, we've definitely seen the left has tried to pin this on conservatives, on conservative people, even though there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that being a case. Unfortunately, when a lie is propagated like that, it tends to spread, and of course, they have no reason to stop that lie. So what we've seen is that Lee Harvey Oswald, who was most certainly a communist, instead of communism being implicated, it's right-wingers, it's conservatives. It's wild.
I can't dispute that, and I would say that the whole communist movement, while we have a law against it, by the way, since 1954, it seems to continue to propagate. And when the New York Times and even, I guess, the ACLU, we can't necessarily leave them out of this conversation. We haven't settled anything, and yet I don't think that some of those outlets are wanting to settle it. Do you?
Not at all. And it is interesting you bring up the ACLU, because Oswald was, in fact, a card-carrying member. He asked for a lawyer from the ACLU to defend him in his case. So there hasn't been, the account from these groups to some of the things that they've done in the past. And unfortunately, there's been this red herring of trying to pin conservatives and right-wing haters, as they always try to construe conservative people in general in this country. This has been such a common refrain for them. It's an old left-wing tactic. One of the very interesting things I think that came out in the few files that were released from this JFK thing was that it's clear that the left in the Soviet Union was trying to play the left in the United States, trying to fuel this idea that it was reactionaries and right-wingers who were to blame for Kennedy's death. So this wasn't just liberals in the United States making up excuses. This was also a product of Soviet propaganda that was pushing them to craft this narrative to implicate the American right.
Jarrett, we're having a deja vu moment here, aren't we? I mean, isn't that kind of what we're going through here in the last 6 months?
Absolutely, absolutely. It is a tried and true tactic that unfortunately keeps rearing its head. It keeps coming back. It is amazing the parallels when you study history. It's amazing these parallels. You would think that we get used to it and that people would start to doubt the claims from the other side, but unfortunately that hasn't happened. It's been a kind of continual thing through our history, and unfortunately it's playing out today as well.
These files, I didn't see, and I went through, I don't know, probably 10 or 15% of them. I didn't see anything in there that we hadn't already heard in chatter or, in some kind of HBO documentary kind of thing that either one was validated or two, we almost heard it. So it wasn't anything necessarily kind of new to us. And I think some people out there, lots of people out there, had some sizable expectations that there'd be a page or two of something new. And it just, for those that are real studied on the assassination, I think they were majorly disappointed. Are you hearing that in the travels in and around Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. I mean, a lot of the information that was released more confirmed a lot of the stories that had been before. They backed up things. They may have deepened some opinions, but there were no bombshells in what was released in these files. But of course, the question is, what's in those other files that haven't been released yet, and why are they continue to be delayed? I mean, if there were no real bombshells here, nothing. I mean, even some of the questions about the CIA's involvement with Cuba and Fidel Castro and potential assassination attempts on him. Besides those kind of things that were already kind of well known, there wasn't really a whole lot there that was ultimately revealing or would change people's opinions about this case. I think those who already had opinions, that they were already pretty settled, and there was nothing really explosive that got released in this dump. But that's not to say that something can't be released in the future, certainly in the next 6 months, if more actually comes out.
Mexico City, that validated that. But what was particularly interesting is that we had heard the chatter that he had met with the head of the KGB assassination unit, and that was essentially validated, right?
Yeah, that certainly was. And of course, there are lingering questions about what Oswald was doing in the Soviet Union. He had spent a lot of time there. He had spent a lot of time in Mexico. What was his link to the Soviets during this time? Was it a passive link? Was he just trying to become a Soviet citizen? Has been the narrative and been rejected? And what was his link to the Soviet Union? That obviously had gone on for years. Now, obviously, he was a communist sympathizer. He was somebody who definitely liked the ideas of the Soviet Union and wanted to organize on its behalf. Certainly did in the United States. Spent some time in New Orleans trying to organize on behalf of communist causes. But the question is, of course, is how much official connection did Oswald have with the Soviets? And that's something that even in these files, it clears up a little bit, certainly what you related in his connections in Mexico City, but hasn't quite revealed the depth of what his connections or non-connections were to the Soviet official apparatus.
Did we ever hear anything about his parents?
I don't believe that there was anything released in this set of files about his parents. But that's certainly something that would be interesting to get more depth on. But I don't believe anything there's any new information regarding his parents in these files. I could be wrong on that.
I don't think so either. And I thought I asked because I thought maybe I missed it, but I'm not quite sure through all of these decades that we've actually heard anything about parents, grandparents, or siblings, have we?
No, I don't believe so. I believe he did have a brother, but there hasn't been a lot of information on them. And certainly, there are thousands of these documents that have been released. There's also stuff that people just haven't combed through this entirely yet. Obviously, there are those who are dedicated to this subject will be doing so in future months, but there are literally tens of thousands of reams of files to go through and search through. So, more information could come out, but I would say that it's unlikely that we're going to see anything truly explosive. The changes are our opinion of what actually happened on that day when Kennedy was killed.
Have facts been conflated over the years? I mean, we heard that it was the mafia, and then we heard it was Lyndon Johnson and this and that. I think it cleared up maybe some of those, but I think other facts have necessarily gotten conflated, especially when it comes to Jack Ruby. It's like, where did he come from in all of this?
Right, and that's some stuff and I think that stuff is going to continue to be debated after this document dump. I don't think anything that we saw here really cleared up those questions in particular. I think that those have certainly lingered over the years, and what was the FBI's involvement, things like that. I don't think anything's been, and maybe that is some of what will be in these files that are released in the hopefully in the near term future that we'll get a better grasp on. But it's pretty clear if you read some of these documents, there's a lot of confusion that was going on amongst agencies as far as what was happening. I mean, the assessment of what was happening on the ground, the hours that followed, was extremely confusing, and there was total chaos. So there was even this one line from this document that said that there was a call made to a British newspaper just before Kennedy was killed, saying, "Well, wait for some big news out of America." What does that mean? Did somebody have some inside information about what was going to happen? Is it random incident? Is it random occurrence? I mean, these are hard things to answer, even with all this information out there. So part of the problem is just there was a massive, confusing amount of information that flows in, especially when you read some of this stuff, that a lot of it was just trails going the wrong direction, rabbit trails, and things that would send people off of what the truth was, which I think has fueled a lot of the theories that have happened over the years about this incredible case.
Jarrett, it's very hard for us these days to go back in space and time so many decades ago because they didn't have the technologies. They certainly didn't have DNA testing. They didn't have, all the cameras. They didn't have the types of ballistics, all of these things that we have today. And we have come to expect that they had that back then. And I think that is probably why they say that it was such a botched investigation, especially when the Secret Service cleaned his limousine so fast. Would you agree?
I would absolutely agree with that. That the tools that were available at the time were far more rudimentary than anything we have now, and to expect things to be as clean cut as maybe a modern investigation would be is definitely expecting too much. Which of course this adds the fuel to conspiracies about the case and things like that. So it's certainly not to be unexpected that there was a lot of confusion, and this is a time where you didn't have mass communication like the internet available. You didn't have
NSA.
Tools. Or NSA, exactly. You didn't have these things that were that even existed. So certainly the fact that there's been so much chaos over this shouldn't be surprising. And what was a major national event, an international event, when you consider the policy implications, our relationship with the Soviet Union, you can see why it was such a monumental event.
You wrote in your piece a little bit about pop culture, and I'm of the notion that pop culture hasn't paid much attention to it. In fact, it obviously was all before their time. But I don't know that they have a lot of interest in this, and if they do, they're sympathetic with an Oswald. Have you seen that?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's why I was. What I really wanted to get across in my piece is that popular culture, unfortunately, has kind of whitewashed over some of these, what Oswald was, and the what had actually killed Kennedy on that day. I mean, and this is something that you'll get in history books, you'll get from certainly popular media, from the New York Times and the New Yorker. This general idea that, well, it's since the beginning it's been these angry right wingers in Dallas, and this is what killed Kennedy, and it's so blatantly wrong. But popular culture has a way of snowballing these things that may not be based on any truth at all, which is certainly the case when it comes to Lee Harvey Oswald. So those things have snowballed over time, so that of course a generation that may not be very understanding of history, may not have studied up much. If they read a piece and it says, well, right-wing hate killed Kennedy, they would accept that on face value because they haven't been taught the facts or the details otherwise. So that's why it can be particularly pernicious over a generation that really hasn't been informed about these things, and a pernicious lie can really perpetuate itself and implicate the philosophy of one side, which is conservatives, to help what are essentially hardcore left wingers. So that's, I think, what's disturbing in this, and it's been a constant. It's not something that was just started at the time. It was something that we saw on the 50th anniversary of the shooting. So this is something that it's a really dangerous thing for this lie to kind of be perpetuated.
And I would also argue, even with the teachers and the professors, they kind of perpetuate that same notion too, both in high school, public schools, and in later learning in university. Correct?
Oh, absolutely. And this is not just applied to what we know with JFK. I mean, this goes down the line. I mean, I've written a lot lately about kind of the war on history and historical figures, and it's not simply that we're attacking these people for the things that they've done or haven't done, but there's been so much misguided anger, especially when you see these, they're attacking monuments, they're attacking things like that, where I say there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of my generation was not really taught a whole lot about history. So what you have is a very aggressive, activist set that's pushing a society that's largely become ignorant of its history, ignorant of the details. I mean, almost the most basic things have been whitewashed. And, I think that's a really dangerous moment for any civilization. I think, certainly with what, the details of the Kennedy case, but this applies to other facts of our history too, that, the light hasn't been shined on because the youngest generation, millennials, don't have the basic facts. They don't understand that, things like, communism were such destructive influences in the 20th century. They think that communism may have been a good thing. So this is something that I think in the long-term effects are very problematic for our society.
You also mentioned, because the New York Times included it in quotes, the climate of hate, which, they are attributing to certainly the South and especially to Texas. And so now that's just become an accepted new standard here. And I would say that the pop culture and whatnot would point to it and say this is just where we are, correct?
Absolutely. As I said, when you see all these other cases that of, shootings or whatever it is, they go back to this narrative. They go back to the climate of hate that's been caused. Do the people of Dallas particularly like President John Kennedy's politics or policies? Not necessarily, but this doesn't mean that they were murderous or killers in the way that I think has been portrayed by those on the left. And I think that's a vicious way to portray those people, those Americans. And it's fueling their ideology. It's fueling what they want to be done, and it really is just not based on reality or truth.
Parts of these documents were redacted. Jarrett, after all of these years, why release documents that are redacted at all? Have you heard chatter about that? I mean, we know that we've got some, obviously, thousands of pages that are held back, but even the ones that they release had redactions in them. Isn't that just a little suspicious?
It is, and I think that's been part of the problem with this, is that, again, after so much time has now lapsed between the events of today and the events of when Kennedy was assassinated, it is something for the American people to judge. I mean, I know that the kind of narrative is that, well, these are things that are pertain to national security and they can't be released, but I think the American people generally think that they have a right to know about these events of their past that have been cataloged before. So I think there's a justified anger, and it kind of plays into this idea of the so-called deep state. Who are the people that run our government? For years and years, people are embedded within the bureaucracies that are kind of making decisions for the American people, whether they be in the security agencies or whether they be in the EPA. Is this really, part of what we consider a free republic? And I think that's fueling a lot of the suspicion is that, when we've seen so many years past, we've seen, these calls to have these released even from the President of the United States, that we haven't seen something that's more forthcoming and that's more open about what's going on. We'd like to see a little more transparency when it comes to our government, especially on events that now are decades in the past.
And, hat tip to President Trump for kind of forcing this issue, but he didn't even really get the kudos I think that he deserved in getting these documents out there, did he? It was just a flash moment in the headlines for, I would say, less than 24 hours, and it kind of went away. I'm kind of surprised that he didn't get a little more glory on this one. Are you?
Absolutely, especially you would think from historians and people like that. A lot of these individuals have attacked the Trump administration, but that he would get some credit for revealing some of the facts of what is really our history and really the events of the time. He certainly could have gotten more kudos for this, and it's possible that some of the events of this document release were buried by the news, but it was also buried by the fact that these documents simply weren't released. They weren't allowed for the public to see. So, that's been kind of the unfortunate part of this, is that, Trump has called for this. We expected this massive dump of documents. We only kind of got a half attempt to get the information out there, and now we're going to sit and wait on the rest of these documents to release. Who knows if that's even going to happen at the end of the day.
I guess we'll have to wait for Larry Sabato, because I think that he's got actually a history class, and he's assigned his students to dive into these and see what they come up with. I think it's kind of a neat assignment that he's given them, and he's been I think one of the lead historians on all of this. I don't know that any others. I mean, so many books have been written, but I think he's probably the more fair one. Have you heard of anybody else?
Actually, I was going to recommend him. He's actually done the best. But, there will be more in the upcoming days. A lot of universities have been working on these papers. And so I think we're definitely going to get more information as time goes by. I mean, it has to be something that, even though we have the internet, we have fast access to information, there are, thousands, tens of thousands of, words and documents to go through. Some of this information is likely going to trickle in as people become more acquainted with it. And a lot of the information also in these documents is in confusing language that is difficult for the average person to understand. It's in kind of this language that these agencies use that isn't really apparent to the average person. So, it is going to take a lot of digging. And, again, historians and people who want to document this should be very thankful at least some of these items are getting out there so that we have a better understanding of the debates that were going on within the agencies and the discussions about, what had happened that eventually, of course, led to the death of the president.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jarrett Stepman at the Daily Signal. If you don't subscribe, please do. And Jarrett, thanks for being with us. And ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you again very soon.